so from a perspective that I would call world ecology, and you'll see this term come up in the lecture. This is world-ecology. In Swedish, I suppose, or German, we would put both of them together, but world ecology is not the ecology of the world, but rather a way of talking about civilizations or historical systems that exist over large time and long space. And the view is that civilizations make nature and nature makes civilization. So there is a process of co-production, or what I will call the double internality, and I'll get into that later in the talk. So the central distinctive characteristic of world ecology relative to other relational traditions like actor network theory is that our intention is to take the long-standing view that humans are part of nature and to put that to work in our understanding of how modernity has come to be the way that it is. So we have a historical project, a historical analysis, and our historical analysis is organized and orchestrated with an eye towards understanding the present conjuncture, which, as the themes of the course outline, are quite turbulent, and we live at a momentous point in human history. I saw that John Bellamy Foster was also assigned for this week, and I think Foster makes a strong case for understanding this as a fundamental shift, even though Bellamy Foster and I have very different ways of looking at the situation. So, but what I wanted to do, and I'm going to stir the pot here a little bit to start, is I was looking at the themes of this course, and the way that it was presented, I'm going to raise some questions about, because I think the presentation was, well, things are getting a lot better in the global south, the economy's been moving slowly, but there's this ecological underside. And so that's one of the things that I'm going to really question in this talk is, to what degree is this actually true, but also to what degree is it best to understand what is going on as this interaction of the ecology on one side and the economy on the other side. So I actually see these figures a little bit differently. I don't think that we do see a decline in global poverty. I think the World Bank data, which is universally endorsed by the business press, the Economist magazine, neoclassical economists, is not valid. But even if you do take it as valid, all the poverty decrease in the world since 1980 has occurred in China. Otherwise, you see an increase. But $1.25 a day is not really a valid measure. So I think that we need to understand that what's going on in the global south is much more serious and much more grave than has been often recognized. And you can see this by, if you take an alternative metric of world hunger using the FAO's expanded, the Food and Agricultural Organization's expanded index of food insecurity and hunger, you have about 2.6 billion people hungry, about 3 billion people not getting the necessary nutrients they need to eat. So is that poverty? Well, I would call that poverty. So I think that we need to question the rosier story. Also, I think the story of declining unemployment doesn't work. In fact, we are living in an era of what the great social theorist Mike Davis calls surplus humanity. That is, for the first time, you have this gigantic layer of humanity for whom modernity has no use and for whom there are no jobs outside the desperation of the informal economy. So I think that the situation is both a human catastrophe for the majority of humans on this planet over the past 30 years, and also a catastrophe for extra-human natures as well. And part of my own project and the community of scholars that we call World Ecology is to bring both of these moments together. We would say that unemployment and deforestation are distinct moments of a way of organizing nature whose origins are found in the long 16th century. So Justin asked me to speak to what is practical, and I thought, well, how do we know what's practical? And I think one of the most dangerous things is to see the sort of common sense practicality as real practicality. And there's common sense and there's good sense. And so my effort is to try to encourage you to think as critically as you can about what gets defined as practical. So I would say there are two big questions, and I'll try to speak to these today. The first is, how do we see, know, and understand the turbulence of the early 21st century? And there's this famous Einstein quote, probably many of you have heard that you cannot solve a problem with the same thinking that created the problem. So part of the same thinking that created this problem today is the idea that social relations go on in one box and are relatively independent or ontologically independent, that is, independent as a condition of their existence from the relations of nature. And this was a magnificent and audacious and also horrible creation of the modern world from its earliest moments in the 16th and 17th century. That is, the origins of nature, and you know this if you've read my pieces, go not to the 19th century or the 18th century, but indeed to the long 16th century. And the idea of nature and the practice of creating an external nature that was external to humans, that was linear, that was flat, that was controllable, that was a fundamental part of the audacious transformations of capitalism, even in its earliest centuries and to this day. And then the second is related to what I've just said as well. If we want to understand practical responses to the present crisis, then we need to understand the origins of that crisis, the origins of the relations of that crisis, not merely the fact that all of a sudden factories appeared or that financial markets appeared. We need to understand the relations that give rise to the crisis today. And those relations, I would stress, are always simultaneously relations between humans and the rest of nature. So we need to get out of this view of seeing modernity or industrial society or civilization as a social force. That there are particular forms of social relations that occur between humans that are also simultaneously relations with the rest of nature. So civilizations are always co-produced. So this is a kind of general warning and a general questioning of how we see practicality. I think oftentimes practicality reinforces the relations of power and production in the world system, and I think we've seen a lot of this with global warming. A lot of the carbon trading, carbon offsetting discourse, that's a perfect example that these are policy responses to global warming that are, in fact, exacerbating the problem. And we've seen lots of evidence of that over the past decade or so. And an alter systemic practicality would be something like food sovereignty. So food sovereignty movements represented institutionally by the family of movements around La Via Campesina says one thing very powerfully. It says democracy, sustainability, and cultural determination, including democratization, are all of a piece. They are all together. You cannot separate out any of those moments from food. And so this is what I've called elsewhere a radical ontological challenge to the dualism of nature and society, of economy and ecology that has dominated the world system and in fact dominated reformist efforts in the past. So food sovereignty is a powerful claim because it says that food is about culture, that food is about power, that food is about sustainability all at the same time, and you cannot think through any of those moments without the other. You can't think through nature without power and culture, and vice versa. So we want to be aware of how we deal with the big concepts and the big realities that we're facing, because as the French anthropologist Bourdieu reminds us, we can easily misrecognize what we see. This comes up all the time when we talk about markets. So a market that is a farmer's market that you might go to and buy some vegetables or some fruit is not at all the same as a financial market, and is not at all the same as what we call capitalism or the world market, because the world market in capitalism has always, from the 16th century to the present, been as much about the anti-market, as Brodel would say, as it has been about competition. Critics often say, and quite correctly, that the era of neoliberalism, of free trade, could just as easily be called the era of neo-mercantilism, that is, the era of regulated trade. And in fact, the whole history of the WTO, of the Agreement on Agriculture, and the battles over the liberalization of food reveal that this is a contest over how markets are constructed in the world system. So we need to be very, very critical and skeptical about market-based solutions because they tend to confuse and to conflate different historical forms of the market. Okay, so we have this term, the green economy, and so I'm going to again put these concepts under the microscope a bit. I think one of the things that's not appreciated is that the idea of the environment is a relatively new idea, and in fact it only comes into the political discourse in the 1970s. And the term the environment comes out of the business and policy establishment, especially linked to the big energy companies in the United States in the 1970s. Environmentalist movements in the 70s didn't talk about the environment, they talked about ecology, they talked about the ecology. So I want us to be aware that this creation of a sacred political object of the environment comes out of both progressive and conservative impulses in recent world history. And that, for that matter, this term, the economy, is also a very recent vintage. That the economy is really become another sacred object that the economists love to talk about. But that too is relatively new. So the first usage of the economy comes from John Maynard Keynes in the India Colonial Office in 1919, and really doesn't come into circulation until after World War II. So we treat these objects of the environment and the economy as set and consolidated and as if they have always been there, which they have not been. So I'm very skeptical of efforts that try to contain our thinking within these the interaction of these two boxes of the environment and the economy. Okay, so sorry, we're skipping around here. So I would say that instead of beginning with economic or environmental relations and then looking at how they interact, we could do better. We could look at how the relations of power and production and reproduction are forged between humans and extra-human nature. So any great project in human history that you can imagine is a way of organizing the relations between humans and the rest of nature. So the preposition makes all the difference, and or in. Do we see historical change as one of humanity, which is not nature, and environment, which is not humanity, or is it humanity in nature and simultaneously nature in humanity? So this is a big question that might sound very philosophical, and it is a philosophical question. And the reality is that one's answer to the question, you can never get away from philosophy. Philosophy can't solve any problem, but it's very difficult to solve any problem without some good philosophy. And so one's answer leads to these questions of and or in, humanity and nature, capitalism and nature, or humanity in nature. Your answer to these two options gives us very different ways of seeing history, including the present. And let's remember that 5 minutes ago when I started this talk, it's still history. And one's answer leads to very different views about what is necessary or practical to respond to today's problems. So the biggest example, and I know that you've read at least a bit about this, today is this contest, which is a very lopsided contest, and Anthropocene is winning, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, that people like me and Donna Haraway and Elmar Alvadar and even Andreas Malm here in Sweden are saying Anthropocene or capitalism. Is it age of man, so humanity plus nature, or is it the age of capital in nature? And this means that we need to discern two very different kinds of information. The Anthropocene proposes a periodization of geological history. And so the way that the geologists go about this is that they look for the stratigraphic signals, what they call golden spikes. So they look at the layers and they see what was happening, and then they draw their conclusions. And of course, like anything, there's a lot of debate. But we know from the work of Will Steffen and Paul Crutzen and John McNeill and Jan Zelasovic and many others that one interpretation is now dominant. 1800. And this is a very, very old story. And I'm going to speak to that old story because the idea that modernity begins in 1800 is a very powerful organizing myth of our world and of our stories around so-called environmental crisis. So in the Anthropocene argument, we need to be very clear that there is a slippage. And they begin with one argument, which I think is a very good argument, a very reasonable argument, and a very useful argument, which is they are going to look for the golden spikes, and then they are going to propose a new periodization of world history, of geological history, sorry. The other is that they are going to look for the environmental consequences of what they call anthropogenic drivers. And there are lots of problems with this concept, anthropogenic. For one, because it collapses all of the differences between humans. And that is deeply problematic, and it is a deeply powerful political claim. And that point cannot be stressed enough. So the argument for the search for geological facts and geological periodizations is a good one. It tends to slip into arguments for historical change, and that is powerfully political. And if you don't believe it, look at any account of trying to deal with the climate crisis or any number of other crises today, and they all rest on a certain conception of history. Most of all, usually they rest on a conception of history that goes to the Industrial Revolution, which, as I will suggest, is problematic. So the geological argument of the Anthropocene is good and useful, in my view. But it confuses something very important. And this is widespread. You see this in Earth system sciences all the time. That they don't understand that geological facts are geological facts and they are not historical facts. What are historical facts? Historical facts are patterns of power and production and reproduction in the life of civilizations. So the historical fact is the dominance of the seigneur-peasant relation in medieval Europe. So that is a broad historical geographical reality. And historical facts, as in my example of medieval Europe, are always co-produced. They're co-produced by human natures and extra-human natures working and folding together. So when we ask Anthropocene or Capitalocene, by the way, I don't like either of these words. I think they're really ugly. We need to be aware of the different dimensions. There's the geological discussion, but the geological discussion often slips into a historical one, and for that, the Anthropocene advocates seem to know nothing at all about history, and the participation of John McNeill, a great world historian, in these discussions is frankly baffling to me because it is so deeply historically flawed. So, but what I would say on the positive side is that the Anthropocene argument asks us to think about big history. So I like that. And it poses questions because of its framework, which says humans are in one box, the anthropogenic, and environmental consequences and nature are in another box. It poses questions that it cannot answer. And that fundamental question is when and where and how did humanity's modern relation with the web of life begin? And that is a deeply historical question and probably the central historical question that we need to answer to thinking about how we want to respond to the global turbulence of human and extra-human natures in the present. So when we bound a historical process in time and space, this shapes what we see as important. So where you draw the lines around time and space, where you start the clock, and where you draw the lines around parts of the planet tells you really predetermines the analysis in very, very powerful ways. So if you start the clock of modern history in 1784 with the rotary steam engine and all of that, you have in England, of course, we have a very, very different view of history and of today's problems than we do if we begin with the English and Dutch agricultural revolutions, with Columbus and the conquest of the Americas, and with the first signs of a massive and epoch-making transition in landscape transformation that began not in 1800, but in 1450. And later on in the second part of this talk, I'm going to go through a number of examples of this epoch-making transition in environment making after 1450. So the danger always when we're talking about these big questions is that we forget about history. And this is the case with the Anthropocene. This is also the case with people like John Bellamy Foster, who often invoke history but never really say anything about it. And this is a problem because it takes time and substitutes it for history. It takes space and substitutes it for geography. It takes quantification as a substitute for analyzing the real historical relations of power and production and reproduction, of empires, of classes, of genders, of races, of nations in the making of the modern world. So, by the way, none of this says time, space, and quantification is unimportant. We still need those, but we need the qualitative moments of history, geography, and the relations of power and production and reproduction to help us frame what is meaningful when we go about quantifying the world around us. So this confusion of geological facts comes out for historical facts comes out very, very clearly in the discourse around the Anthropocene. And so they don't understand that coal is just a rock in the ground. It only becomes a fossil fuel in particular historical circumstances when definite class relations and other definite relations of power come into play. So it's only when coal gets bundled with the modern relations of capital that it becomes a fossil fuel. And by the way, that doesn't happen in 1710 or 1712 with the first steam engines. It happens in the 1530s and 40s. It happens in the long 16th century, which is when the real revolution in coal mining in England begins. So why the Anthropocene is so important for environmentalist thought, for what I call green thought, is that it fits very, very nicely into an older myth that I've already spoken to, which is this idea of the Industrial Revolution as the origins and the drivers of ecological crisis. This is what I called over a decade ago the industrialization thesis. And it is deeply problematic because it is so empirically wrong. For one thing, industrialization doesn't begin in the 18th century. It begins in what Ferdinand Braudel 16th century between 1450 and 1550, an audacious period of mechanization. And it's crucial to understand that the modern world is characterized by waves of industrialization that are the expression of reorganizations of global nature. And that point cannot be stressed enough, that industrialization is dependent upon empire and science to make available what Marx very critically called the free gifts of nature. So without empire and science and colonialism and all the rest, you cannot provide the cheap labor power, energy, food, and raw materials to industry to make capitalism profitable. So industrialization is the consequence of a revolution in environment making. It is not the cause, although of course history is a cascade of cause and effect. So it's always more complex than that. But what I'm trying to do is to turn inside out a lot of our assumptions about how environments get made and how environmental crises relate to the rest of modernity. So here you see on the screen just this argument that we need to really question this green arithmetic, society plus nature. This is the position both of radicals like Bellamy Foster and of the Anthropocene advocates. It's society plus nature. Now, the problem with society plus nature is it doesn't add up. And it's talked about as if you add up the economy and the environment, then you have an environmental crisis, or you have the crisis of capitalist ecology or something like that. But it's not that way at all, because if you add up two fictitious numbers, you don't get closer to reality. And that's a lot of what we're dealing with today. So the alternative is to see capitalism as a world ecology in which the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the co-production of nature are an organic and evolving whole. And this inverts, again, one of the staples of green thought, one of the conventions of green thought. Most environmentalists think that the problem is that humans are separate from nature. I would say that the issue is precisely the inverse, that the question is, how do humans fit into nature, and how does nature fit into humanity? And it's only when we can begin to look at how human relations are produced by the rest of nature, as well as a producer of changes in the rest of nature, that we can begin to ask, how do different configurations of humanity and nature allow for oppression and violence, or emancipation and sustainability? And so again, when I talk about capitalism, it's not the usual cardboard cutout view of capitalism. And in fact, it's not even although we will get to a theory and a kind of model, it's not even a theoretical approach. It is a methodological approach. It is a way of understanding how humans fit into the web of life in the modern world. And the modern world begins in the long 16th century. So I would say that instead of the usual talk about capitalism as an economic system, capitalism as a social system, capitalism as a system of commodification, that it's something a bit different. And it does have to do with all of those elements I just mentioned. But the central tension is between the commodity system, which is always expanding and always trying to devour the rest of uncommodified nature, including human nature. The contradiction is between the commodity system and the conditions of its reproduction. And that means that we bring in the unpaid work and energy of humans and the rest of nature. The great German sociologist Maria Mies talks about this in terms of women, nature, and colonies. Any ecological analysis that does not put gender and the relations of socio-ecological reproductions at its center will not give rise to a vigorous and effective alternative to the present disastrous state of affairs. We need to understand that the commodity system is vitally dependent on the unpaid work energy of humans and the rest of nature, including something we call ecosystem services. So why is this so important? Because the conditions of capitalism's reproduction are in this uncommodified nature that is outside the market but within capitalist power, and it has to be bigger than the relations of commodity production and exchange itself. So when we talk about the capitalocene, we're not taking this cardboard cutout view of capitalism and putting it onto history. We're trying to understand how a concept of capitalism, in the way that I've been talking about it over the past decade, helps us understand some deeper realities about how gender and power and reproduction and the web of life all fit together. And in this, I would say that capital becomes a kind of gravitational field. It's not a mechanism, it's not a structure, but it's a kind of organic gravitational field in which capital not only draws in human and extra-human nature into its vortex of accumulation, but that capital also reshapes all the world around us in specific ways, highlighted by people like Michel Foucault in talking about governmentality and biopower and the power of regularization, that the process of making human populations legible and rational is indeed a response to the power of capital as a gravitational field. So in all of this, we look at history through this double internality. And this says, basically, that capitalism, and it's no different from any other civilization, is constituted through a double internalization. Capitalism in nature, nature in capitalism. And this means that capitalism internalizes the relations of the biosphere, and at the same time, nature internalizes the relations of capital. And both are going on simultaneously. And that is why the process of understanding, especially capitalism today, is much more relational than we often understand when we look at it at first. That we need to understand that this is a process of historical change in which we are dealing with an evolving and shifting mosaic of interdependent flows, forces, conditions, and relations. And so this means that capitalism doesn't have an environmental history. It doesn't have an ecological dimension. It is in itself a way of organizing, of moving, of representing, of channeling the singular metabolism of the web of life. And in the very act of doing all of this, we can see that human organizations, and capitalism is one of them, acquires new properties over time. This means, in my view, that human organizations are, in some sense, alive. We can go back to the old debate around which is the organism, the bee or the hive. I would say the hive. And the human organization in itself is a hive, but we can see that human organization acquires new properties. It is in itself alive. Human organizations, civilizations especially, not only develop, but they age, they grow, they reach maturity, and then they reach a period of old age and eventually pass from the scene. So what I would say, not just against the Anthropocene argument, but also against much environmentalist thought, not all by any stretch of the imagination, is to really question this category of humanity and to understand that humanity is fundamentally differentiated, but it's also fundamentally coherent in different ways by definite relations of power and production and reproduction. So when we look at things like class, race, and gender, we need to understand that those historical processes always unfold with the rest of nature. So you can look at racial formation in the Americas, or the agricultural and in the early modern era, or the agricultural and scientific revolutions and new gender regimes in early modern Europe, to begin to see just how deeply connected these transformations of science, empire, capital, and nature always are. So this is an approach that, as I mentioned, has some similarities to other relational approaches. Probably the most familiar to some of you will be actor network theory. I've learned a lot from those approaches. World ecology is a bit different because we say, in contrast to actor network theory, that there are real and durable centers of power in the modern world system. So that is crucial, and that insight into understanding power does not just exist as a human construct, but as a co-produced reality with the rest of nature, shapes a series of methodological frames. That is, how do we bound time, space, and nature in our studies? And how do we narrate those changes? And what are the kinds of guiding threads or provisional models that we use in that? And if you have a model that begins with the premise that capitalism or modernity does all sorts of terrible things to nature and acts upon nature, you have a very different, very different study, a very different empirical analysis than you do if you understand that capitalism moves within the web of life, that there is tremendous violence that attaches to capitalism, but that it acts within rather than from outside the web of life. And so in this, we want to keep this dialectic of co-production always at the fore, that modernity is a producer as well as a product. And one of the ways that we do this, and again, I think this is absolutely central to the kinds of alternative or alter-systemic politics that are emerging today, is that we name the relation between humans and the rest of nature. This has been a long struggle for environmentalist thought, and in fact, for over 30 years, environmental scholars have been calling for some vocabulary that brings together the human and the extra-human. Now, my proposal for this has been the oikos. And the oikos is a way of naming the creative, historical, dialectical, multi-layered relation between humans and the rest of nature, and also within various natures. So the relations of power and production unfold within the oikos. And this includes centrally human thought. human thought is not somehow outside of the web of life. And in fact, is, as we know, a profound evolutionary response that allows for us to forge a collective memory. And that, along with our particular patterns of raising families, in which infants are entirely helpless for the first 4 or 5 years or more of life, are profound shapers of the human experience. So we need to see that thought is not somehow outside of nature, that in fact thought practices and thought regimes are central to making environments. And I make the point so strongly because both the Anthropocene arguments and the arguments of people, critical scholars like Hornborg or Foster, have a kind of vulgar materialism in which the long-term history of science and cartographic knowledge and other forms of reckoning with the rest of the world do not get their central place in the history of the modern world. So what we need to understand through the oikos is that the oikos gives us a sense of how civilizations value some things and don't value other things. So a great example of this is that in feudal Europe, land productivity was prioritized. What was valuable was land productivity. Capitalism did something very, very different, and this is vitally important to understanding the patterns of environment making over the past 5 centuries, is that labor productivity within the commodity system became valued. And what that meant is the rest of work was devalued. That is, the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies was devalued and enlisted in support of a really odd project, labor productivity within the commodity system, within cash crop agriculture, within metal producing, within shipbuilding in the early modern era, and then of course all the way through to various industrializations. As I like to say about American history, the necessary condition for the Fordist mass production assembly line worker was the Fordist housewife. And so we need to understand that it's human and extra-human nature that are both devalued through this prioritization of labor productivity within the commodity system. So what the oikos lets us do is to shift from looking at this sacred object, the environment, to seeing that all humanity is involved in environment making. We are, in the words of the biologists, ecosystem engineers. And what I would say beyond that, and I've already hinted at that, is that ideas, scientific practices, cartographic procedures, processes of rationalizing life, culture, these too are material forces in making environments. And that we need to understand that these forces, which don't come directly out of capital often, but are often the projects of states and empires, that these relations of making the world legible and rational for capital accumulation are absolutely central. And this is the production of what I've called abstract social nature, which I won't talk about so much today, but it will come up later in this talk. So when we ask, well, what's being valued when we look at capitalism, I tend to rephrase the old Marxist joke that says, well, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. But the only thing worse than being exploited is being appropriated. And that is what has happened to the work energy of the planet. The work energy of the planet, including human beings, has been appropriated in service to capital accumulation. Obviously, this has been tremendously dynamic. But what I want to try to construct is that you have a dialectic where labor power and work in commodity production is exploited, and unpaid work, largely the work of women, nature, and colonies, is appropriated through various scientific, territorial, and rationalizing procedures. So this is important because if we want to understand this issue of rising resource consumption that's highlighted in the course's themes, we need to understand that every act of exploitation of wage labor depends on a much more expansive act of appropriating the unpaid work of the rest of nature. So this comes out in the absurd discourse, absurd in my view, of the ecosystem services, but it's also highly suggestive And it's also suggested by what was in the 1970s the Marxist-feminist argument, but is today the position even of the UN Development Program, which emphasizes the centrality of domestic labor in the world economy. And if you put the ecosystem services and the domestic labor, the unpaid labor together, you have an estimated dollar value that is 2 to 3 times larger than the actual global domestic product. So when we look at all of this, and let me make sure I keep on time here relatively well, we need to look at, well, where did these relations start to originate? And so what we're going to do is to go from geological history to geohistory, and to understand that coal is just coal. It becomes a historical agent when it gets bundled with the relations of power and production. So what I'll do in the last 20 minutes or so of this talk is to just talk a little bit about the origins of modernity, and to see just historically the origins of modernity as a capitalist world ecology. And I know that you've read a bit about this, so I'm going to go over this very fast, and you can look at this PowerPoint or go and reread the essay, which will both parts of that essay will be coming out in the Journal of Peasant Studies next year, and as will my book, which has that discussion in a different register. So what we're trying to get away from is what I call the consequentialist bias of environmentalist thought, which basically says what we're going to look at in environmental studies are the environmental consequences, that is, the not human consequences of social relations. I'm not saying consequences are unimportant. They are clearly important. What I'm saying is that in order to understand environment making in the modern world and the nature of the present crisis, we need to understand that environment making is both product and producer of these changes that we see in the environment. Global warming is both product and producer, and capitalism is both product and producer. So we need to get beyond looking at the environmental consequences of social relations. And so one of the great blind spots, we have this great historical blind spot in environmentalist thought, and it has to do with what's called the early modern era or early capitalism. And both mainstream and Marxist analysts will say, well, early capitalism isn't real capitalism. Real modernity begins in the 18th and 19th century. And it's a real problem because that view doesn't actually accord well with our thinking. This category of the pre-industrial that's applied to the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe is completely unsupported empirically because it was emphatically not a pre-industrial society, as we'll see. Now, one of the things that got me started on all of this was not some great theoretical insight, but rather was a simple historical observation. And that historical observation runs like this. The scale, speed, and scope of environmental change after 1450 in the Europe-centered world economy exceeded the environmental transformations of medieval Europe, often by an order of magnitude, that is 5 to 10 times. If you look at rates of deforestation, rates of soil exhaustion, rates of other kinds of socio-ecological transformation, you have an extraordinary break that occurs between 1450 and 1650, or what I am calling the long 16th century. The comparable scale of change had been seen before. You could look at China and the Great Wall or the Egyptian pyramids, but never before had scale, speed, and scope occurred at the same time. Never before had a civilization gone through a succession of what I've called commodity frontiers, one after the other, in roughly 50 to 75 year cycles. We'll see a bit of that. But here's my great stylized fact for this talk. So if you looked at Picardy in northeastern France, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest in the 12th and 13th centuries. 4 centuries later in northeastern Brazil, at the height of the sugar boom, that much forest was cleared in a single year, no thanks to the steam engine. Okay, so here we are seeing a clear and radical and rapid and epoch-making shift from one mode of environment making to another mode of environment making. And maybe you don't want to call it capitalism, that's okay with me, but recognize the significance of this shift that occurs in the long 16th century. What I would say is that early capitalism is indeed real capitalism in every way that we talk about it today. And that if we want to understand its origins and the rise of capitalism, we need to look at earth moving. So that involves planting fields, clearing forests, mining, all the rest. It includes mechanization. And perhaps most significantly and most forgotten, it includes symbolic praxis, what I have called the praxis of external nature, of creating an external nature through a series of scientific and imperial and capital procedures. This highlights, instead of the role of technology in itself, this highlights Lewis Mumford's great concept of technics. Technics are machinery and empire and power and tool and nature and capital all together. To treat the earth and its nature and its creatures, including most humans, as a prop to labor productivity within the commodity system. So when we see the origins of this world that we live in today, we can look, yes, at the revolution and the role of commodity production and exchange. Capitalism didn't invent commodification, it didn't invent markets, but it made the commodity system its organizing pivot. So for the first time in world history, with the rise of capitalism, we had a civilization in which decommodification on a system-wide basis never occurred. That had always occurred before. It had occurred in Rome, it occurred in Song China, it occurred in medieval Europe. You had decommodification after a period of commercial expansion. That never happened even in the history in the great history of capitalism's crises. Now, the second moment, and this can't be overemphasized, is that there was a revolution in ways of seeing and ways of knowing reality. This is suggested by Max Weber's European rationality of world domination, but it goes far, far beyond that. In other words, the rise of capitalism marked a revolution in ontological and epistemological thinking about the relations between humans and the rest of nature. This is captured in part by the great environmental historian Carolyn Merchant's book on the death of nature. And from these earliest moments, we see new measures of reality. This is from Alfred Crosby. Everybody knows him from the Columbian Exchange, but in fact, he has another, I think, better book called Measures of Reality, and in which you see a view of nature as external, a view of space as flat, a view of time as linear come into being. And that last moment is, I think, spectacularly important. Here I would quote Lewis Mumford in saying, "The clock, not the steam engine, is the key machine of modernity." If you want to understand capitalism, you need to understand that it is a system of time that tries to annihilate space and nature into the regularization and rationalization of time. So in this era, we have a new world of quantifiable abstractions and ways of knowing reality, new cartographies, new ways of surveying, new schools of painting and music that are very regularized or have to do with perspective, Renaissance perspective, for instance, new philosophies of mind and body, nature and society, people like René Descartes, Francis Bacon, and new relation to books. So here we need to understand that the history of ideas is deeply, powerfully a material history. So what were these epochal shifts? Well, you've read a bit about this, so I'm going to go over a very stylized list of all of this in the next few minutes. But of course, there's the history of the first agricultural revolutions. It doesn't start in England, it starts in the Low Countries, moves to England. So these radical agricultural revolutions in which rising agricultural productivity for the farmer was a condition for the farmer keeping the land. What did that mean? It meant that productivity was privilege over land. You see radical commodity-centered mining and metallurgical revolutions that, again, begin in Europe and then move outward, both to Scandinavia and England, and of course, most famously, to the Americas, to the Andes and Potosi. You have the sugar commodity frontier moving all the way across the Atlantic, from the Atlantic Islands and Madeira and Sao Tome to Brazil to the Caribbean. You can see this little chart here, which I give to you to see just how fast things were moving. And we need to remember that before modernity, environmental change was measured and it occurred really over centuries. And now it occurred over decades. And that's why you see this profound restlessness of the sugar commodity frontier. And you see basically these 50 to 75-year cycles appear. And what I would share with you is through my historical research that we see this kind of pattern appearing again and again in a lot of different sectors, in fisheries, in metals, in timber and forest products industries, and all of this. Environment making doesn't just have to do with landscapes, it also has to do with human nature. So every time the sugar frontier moved, the slaving frontier moved too. And so you can see these recompositions of the slaving frontier and the slave trade in Africa. So again, remember, race, gender, class are co-produced through the web of life. You see the rise of Potosi and its dramatic restructuring after 1571. What the Spanish Empire did after beginning in 1571 was to reorganize the entire population of what they called Peru, which was 1.5 million people, on the basis of these strategic or sort of European-style villages to supply labor to the mines. Now, 1.5 million people doesn't sound like a lot today, but that was the entire population of Portugal. So that was an audacious reorganization of human and extra-human nature that wasn't just about digging minerals out of the ground. It was about a radical transformation of land and labor and ideas and technology and all of the rest. This reached into Southeast Asia as the Dutch, the great superpower of the 17th century, moved to control the spice trade, cutting down spice trees anywhere that was not in their favored zone. This is also a story of what happened in Europe, and I've told this story in the Amsterdam Standing on Norway essays, that you see the conversion of the extended Baltic from southern Norway, believe it or not, to Russia as a neo-colonial supply zone for timber, forest products, and cereals. So this isn't just a story of colonialism. This is a story of the neo or semi-colonies within Europe. You see this with the fishing fleets that are moving all across the Atlantic. You see a kind of deforestation that had never occurred so fast in world history. What you have is this extraordinary acceleration of environmental change. Let's remember, because it's always forgotten, that the coal revolution in England, as I mentioned earlier, begins in the 1530s. It doesn't begin in the 18th century. So if we want to talk about something that looks like fossil fuel capitalism, then begin in the 1530s, because that's where it began. And of course, we have the Columbian Exchange, the movement of Old World and New World flora and fauna and diseases. And crucially, this was far more than a passive process. It didn't just happen. The movement of maize and potatoes into the Old World, which was so significant, took a lot of coordination amongst people. So too did the lethal impact of Old World diseases in the New World. It wasn't simply that the diseases came and killed a lot of people. That did happen, but that the demographic decline was reinforced by the processes of commodification and colonialism. So all of this means that we need to pay attention to how technology and how production works in the modern world and how that relates to socio-ecological reproduction. And that's absolutely crucial. Here I'm just going to give a few tidbits because we think of this period as somehow technologically inert, which it wasn't. And here I would just tick off the printing press, sugar mills in the colonies, sugar refineries in Europe, huge blast furnaces in iron making, new ships which were built with standardized parts and with mechanized sawmills. You have the rapid development of spread of iron tools in agriculture, which had already been fairly widespread, but were extended quite a bit. You have new techniques of mining in the New World, famously the mercury amalgamation process. And within Central Europe, at the very beginning, you have the Sager process that allowed for copper and silver ores to be smelted with lead. If you don't have that, it's very questionable that you have the rise of capitalism because you need a physical basis for money. In that era, you needed a physical basis for money more than most. You had labor productivity revolutions in textile making, in the deployment of water mills, in spring-driven clocks, and we could go on and on and on and on. So what we need to try to do is to put these developments of mechanization, the developments in commodification and accumulation, and the transformations of nature, which include new scientific and cartographic and agronomic practices, into a whole approach. So you can't think of the Dutch as the superpower of the 17th century without understanding that, amongst other things, what the first thing that they did, and the Portuguese and the Spanish had done this before, is set out to map and gather information about the world around them in a systematic way. And this was not just about the colonial project, although crucially about that, but also about how do you organize property within Europe. And so that's why you have this amazing historical geography of the Netherlands and England, especially, where modern property relations, which, by the way, have everything to do with environmental crises, took place. So you have to have ways to draw lines around land, which is to say to draw lines around nature if you want to have capitalism. Let's remember, too, that it's not just extra-human natures, that the condition for the transformation of landscapes is a transformation of human nature and vice versa. So here we have a new sense of rationalized work time, a new creation of a tight relation between world money and world nature. We know this today because the US dollar is the reserve currency. Its physical basis is really the barrel of oil. It has been since the early 1970s, when the world moved from a gold standard to an oil standard, that we have this very tight relation between world money and world nature emerge with the stock market, the Bourse of Amsterdam, the American silver flowing into Amsterdam, the terrific range of commodities traded in Amsterdam on the stock market, the Bourse, 360 different commodities by 1639, and that the coordination and the symbolic rationality of this stock market provided the basis for, as Tim Langley says, for the universalization and intensification of world credit. So if you don't understand how world credit and world finance works, you can't understand how the transformation of nature works in the modern world, because world money and world nature go together very, very tightly. All right, so we're going to wrap up here and just point to some of the really major issues that we're dealing with. Does this mean that the 18th and 19th centuries were unimportant? No. Clearly, you have an important transformation of capitalism and historical nature in this period. And that has to be explained and dealt with. But what we are seeing, is a turning point. It is what I would call a developmental crisis and not an epochal crisis. The crisis of medieval Europe in the 14th century was an epochal crisis because you saw the end of one way of organizing wealth, power, and nature, and the emergence of a new way of organizing wealth, power, and nature in this transition from feudalism and land productivity to modernity and labor productivity. But what we see in the 18th and 19th centuries is a qualitative transformation within a mode of producing wealth, nature, and power. Okay? So, and crucially, the work of this first era of what's usually called the Industrial Revolution, that is 1760 to 1830. And let's remember that steam doesn't really displace water power until the 1830s in England, and coal doesn't displace charcoal in the United States until the 1870s. So let's not make this all about coal. That what you see is this audacious enlargement of the possibilities of appropriating the wealth of global nature. So why does the center of world power and production move to the United States? Well, because the United States could appropriate for free or low cost the unpaid work of an entire continent. So we need to look at how these relations fit together. Okay, so now we're back to more or less where we began. The limits to nature, what limits what nature? And those are the big questions we need to ask every single time we think about these terms, the limits to nature. Well, I would say, and these are my propositions for our discussion, is that first of all limits are historical. What's a limit? A limit for one civilization will not be a limit for another civilization. The cold weather of what's called the Little Ice Age was a limit for feudal Europe, not because of technology, not because it was impossible to have a different way of growing food, but because the class relations of feudalism did not allow for a conversion to an alternative and more sustainable structure. Medieval Europe was not overpopulated. It was simply that the existing class relations and territorial relations did not allow for a conversion to an alternative way of growing food. So we need to look at how limits emerge out of the specific configuration of human and extra-human natures. The other is that nature is not external. Yes, when we look at it in a common sense way, yeah, nature is external. This is, in fact, if you're wondering this is not a constructionist argument. Yes, there is a kind of nature in general that's somewhere out there, but the way that we know nature is not nature in general. The way that we know nature is through our specific life activity of thought and action and reflection and praxis. So the reevaluation of our specific actions and our specific knowledge in light of our experience. So one of the most dangerous things that's happened is that environmental thinkers continue to use the idea of nature in general as if that's what we're dealing with. We're not. We're dealing with a specific historical nature in a specific historical period in which humans are a part of nature. And so far from denying that the biosphere doesn't exist, I would say that what I'm arguing with world ecology and what a growing family of scholars have been arguing with world ecology is that in fact we give more agency to geological and biospheric change than this construct of nature plus society. Because we see that extra-human natures bundle up with specific relations of class and production and reproduction to produce definite limits, but also to produce definite opportunities. And that's what we have to be thinking about if we want an alternative to the present present mode of organizing life on this planet. So this feeds into my point that we need to understand that we're not dealing with nature in general, we're dealing with historical nature, and that historical nature is the field upon which humans operate. And we change that field, and that field changes us. So this is the double internality again. And finally, we all need to get smart, and much smarter, about how capitalism actually works and how wealth or capital is accumulated. And historically, it's been accumulated on a very definite model of the exploitation of labor power. And then for every act of exploitation, think of the great industrial revolutions, if you will, you need an even larger act of appropriating the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. Now, what's happened today, and I've written quite a bit about the end of cheap food, which you can go and look at, is that cheap food, just to start, is ending because the opportunities for appropriating the unpaid work of the rest of nature are starting to contract dramatically. And climate change is a big part of it, but it's not the only part of it. So we need to understand how exploitation and appropriation fit together in the way that capital appropriates the world, but also the way that capital actually works. And I think that one of the big problems with environmentalist thought is, aside from James O'Connor and aside from me, and you can read my book that'll be out next summer, is nobody wants to deal with the core issues of political economy. Now, the result is that both mainstream and radical political economists, mainstream neoclassical economists and radical political economists, continue to act as if capital sort of accumulates outside the web of life and then goes and does terrible things. But what we need to understand is that nature as a whole is a powerful shaper of capital accumulation. We need to understand how wealth is accumulated and how power is accumulated in specific historical patterns. And if we don't understand that, we can't adequately understand the precise contradictions and the precise weaknesses of the system that we're dealing with. So if we want to deal with practicality, which I see as a question of political strategy, then we need to understand capitalism's vulnerabilities and its contradictions, and especially the way that new vulnerabilities and new contradictions are emerging in the present conjuncture. And what I would just point out is that what we are seeing today, and I know that you've taken a look at my End of Cheap Nature essay, is the end of cheap nature, not as a thing, not in the sort of narrower peak oil sense, but in the sense of the strategy that I've outlined. that it's the end of a strategy of producing cheap nature. Why? Because the way that humans and the rest of nature are now bundling up is producing resistant and hostile forms to capital accumulation. This occurs both in world agriculture and something called the superweed effect, where weeds are evolving faster than the herbicide regimes, but it's also happening with the social movements, with food sovereignty. So we're seeing a transition from what they've called a surplus value to negative value. So the limit to capitalism is, well, first of all, co-produced through the oikos, this dynamic, multi-layered relation of life-making. It's a civilizational relation that has moved through long expansion to long crisis today, although how long that crisis will persist is in doubt, because global warming is so fundamentally changing everything about capitalism, every sort of stable condition for reproducing capitalism that we've known. Part of that, of course, is the declining capacities to secure and to deliver cheap natures into capital accumulation. So we have unprecedented highs over the past decade for oil, metals, and food. And even though, yes, the price of oil has gone down to temporary lows of $83, $82 a barrel, that is almost certainly not going to last. And I can explain why that is. It has quite a bit to do with how capitalism works. So thanks. I know that was a lot, and I will call it short at 7 minutes over. Thank you. And just to your question, if people want to take a break, that's fine, but we can also just keep talking.
Yeah.
Oh, and
We have to change so people can speak. Okay.
I have a question. I think it's
tell me your name before you start. We should
yeah.
tell me your name.
My name is Marijke. Can
Marijke.
you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I think it's not only my own question. When we've been when we were outside during the break, we were discussing this. So it is very interesting what you say about how we should look at history in a different way and about the problem in general. But how will this new perspective help us to create a new solution or a better solution? Have you thought about that as well?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. Well, I think first is you have to look at how capitalism puts together commodity relations with relations of what I call appropriation. So the appropriation of ecosystem services, of unpaid domestic labor, and so much more that those two categories don't comprehend. So you have to look at that relation, and that's always been a deeply and powerfully unequal relation. So, and then you need to understand that, I mean, as you know in Europe from the degrowth movement, that capitalism is a system premised on endless growth. The growth of what? Well, the growth of commodification, because that's the only thing that shows up in national accounts, gross domestic product accounts. The point made by Marilyn Waring, I think 2 decades ago in her wonderful book, If Women Counted, basically say, you know, the work of unpaid work of women and nature doesn't matter to capitalism. Well, it does matter, and the condition of capitalism existing in its present state is that ecosystem services or domestic labor remain unpaid. Why? Because if they were capitalized, if capitalism had to pay for its costs of reproduction, nobody would be able to make a profit. And for me, I'm not so sure that that's a bad thing. So I think the answer is to highlight the relations of commodification and push for decommodification. I don't think it matters particularly if it looks environmental or not, because we are in a situation where the costs of production for capitalism as a whole are skyrocketing. The evidence is now in very, very clearly. Production costs in energy are rising dramatically. Production costs in agriculture, even in Brazil, are rising dramatically. Labor costs in the heartlands of industrial production, China, are rising dramatically. So anything that we can do to push costs higher will be good, because what we want to do is to create a world in which this violent abstraction of the commodity form doesn't govern everything that we do. So, in a word, push for decommodification.
Yes. More questions?
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
That's Felix.
Okay, so I was to push for the decommodification, but at the same time you want to highlight the relationship. But practically, I mean, don't you think actually things like ecosystem services, even though they're flawed and etc.
My connection is a little bit light, right? Can you say it a little bit louder?
In terms of highlighting the relationship, right, of nature, nature and economy and nature, and even if you say that this transaction happens at the same time, right? Like at the time that we're using nature, we're also creating nature, and vice versa. Why would you be so against ecosystem services? I mean, I know they're used in a way to gain more access to resources, to commodify them, and to bring them into the economy and speculate on them. But wouldn't you think that at a certain point, it would actually, you need these kind of tools to be able to show how it is not profitable to do this. There is going to be a social cost, and
Right.
that it needs to stop. So there's, of course.
That's right.
So, what do you think about that?
So let me. The connection was a little weak. So let me make sure that I understand. So if we quantify ecosystem services, that can serve a useful pedagogical purpose. Is that?
Well, if you wanna get to the point where you can show how unprofitable a certain action is, if you want to actually show the cost somehow, and do this at a scale that it matters to the world, to save humanity or whatever, then don't you need something like ecosystem services?
Well, I don't have any problem with quantifying ecosystem services. It's the premise that the problem is for people like Costanza. Okay, so the major guy who sort of began this much bigger literature. I mean, Costanza is a total neoclassical kind of guy. So, like Mathis Wagenickel around the ecological footprint, their quantification is premised on a naive sense that capitalism is a kind of efficient system, and if only the markets recognize this, it will all work. So I'm totally in favor of of these kinds of studies in terms of illuminating the absurdity of the civilization we live in. Because the premise is that what counts is what's monetized, but in fact what counts is precisely the opposite. What really counts is what's not monetized. And the condition for monetization is that most of nature remain unmonetized, which is the problem that capitalism faces today. So in a sense, I'm in favor of asking capital to internalize those costs, just like an earlier generation of feminist Marxists asked for wages for housework. Well, the reason why wages for housework couldn't work within capitalism is because if capitalism pays wages for housework, then the price of labor goes up too far and you can't make a profit, which in my mind is not such a bad thing. There's alternative ways of organizing life on this planet. So I think, yeah, I'm not opposed to quantification. In fact, I'm very much in favor of it. The problem is when everything else drops from the frame, as it does for Costanza. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, did you have a question? No? Who else? Yes, please. Yes.
Can you come up?
Loud.
Yeah.
Speak loud, please.
Yeah, close enough. I could hear Justin very well, so closer. Good.
If you could. Keep on five.
Is it here?
Yeah.
I sense a problem with the Marxist view of the world that is centered on work and workers. I think historically everything we produced needed a lot of work, but due to a more advanced technology, we are able to produce more and to work less. And so we assume a new role as consumers. And as consumers, we direct the commerce, the production. We actually steer capitalism by being consumers. So I think the perspective needs to be changed, and that we as consumers must take a role and responsibility. I lack this in most of the discussions, and I think we should assume this new perspective.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I guess I see. First of all, I agree. People should take responsibility to make the world that they want to live in. Yeah. I think what we've seen in the global north over the past 40 years is, for one, by any conventional economic indicator, not a remarkable advance in productivity, but a remarkable slowdown in productivity growth. So the evidence is in pretty strongly that what we've seen is a long-run stagnation in productivity growth since 1973, more or less. And in fact, you were around in the 1970s. The anticipation was that we would have a world of automated factories, of robot factories. What we got was the global sweatshop. So that's a huge thing. I share some of your reservations about the Marxist tradition, and in fact, my critique is directed oftentimes as much at Marxist as it is at neoclassical and other kinds of thought. Are we all living in a world of consumption? I don't know. I tend to look at it a bit differently. In the U.S., but you also see similar trends in the UK and in Europe. What we've seen since about 1973 or 4, maybe a few years later, maybe a few years earlier, is the long-term stagnation or repression of real wages, the growth of profound inequality, and the imprisonment of the vast majority of the population within what are called relations of consumption, but I think are better viewed as relations of reproduction, in which you must pay for health care. I realize not so much in Sweden, but they're working on privatizing healthcare even in Sweden. Education, transportation, housing, all of the rest. I think what often we hear in the environmentalist discourse is the issue is consumption. Well, for one thing, there is very little discretionary income, at least in the United States, and from what I've done research on elsewhere, the room for freedom in consumption is very limited. So most consumption is spent for necessary social reproduction. So, for instance, in Sweden, I didn't need to have a car, but in the United States, I have to have a car. Because the whole society was reconstructed to require people to use a car. That was not consumers demanding to have cars. In fact, dependence on cars is deeply implicated not just in air quality, but in poverty and in hunger and all sorts of different things. So I don't know. Do consumers have some? Clearly, consumers can sometimes organize politically, but I would say that I haven't seen any evidence that this whole process of neoliberal sort of consumer culture is consumer-driven. Now, on the other side, I would say that really the overarching reality of the neoliberal era, because of wage repression, that is, wages haven't grown across the OECD zone, the global north, very much at all since the 1970s. Is that we have not overconsumption, but forced underconsumption. You have profound hunger and poverty all across the global north, but even more so, you have about 3 billion people on the planet, most of whom are in the global south, who can't get the right food to eat. So that's forced underconsumption. So I think for every moment of Swedish-style overconsumption, you have an even greater moment of, that's not my view, but sort of the way that you're talking is, and the way that many people would talk when I was in Sweden was sort of like that, was you have profound poverty. In the United States, you have 1 out of 6 or 7 people hungry, 1 out of 4 children. You have, so even in, the so-called richest country on earth, you have profound poverty and an inability to consume. And then you have the most powerfully constricting relations of consumption, which are those of credit and debt, which we didn't ask for. We didn't ask to be burdened with tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt and car debt and home debt and all the rest. So I would say that a lot of the relations of consumption are in fact deeply oppressive and are related to questions of necessary social reproduction. I don't know that that really speaks against the spirit of your point, which is that we need to take responsibility and consumers can't organize. So.
Well, let me continue that. We have something called economic democracy, but that traditionally refers to workplace democracy. In the case of consumer powers, it should be sort of transversed into something new concept. Maybe?
Yeah, well, I'm a believer in democracy in all areas of life, so I think we agree on that.
Thank you.
Was there any? Okay. Jason, I had a question. Maybe it's a combination, but well, we had also as part of the literature today Foster's Marx and the Reef in the Universal Metabolism of Nature as a lecture. And then I was thinking a little bit because you name it in this ecological crisis and the agrarian question, but he is commenting in his article the question that the left has given him criticism because they find that this contradiction between the rural and the urban, the metabolic rift, is represent the Cartesian dualism. How do you see that? And that a little bit remind me of when you were also talking about organic whole. I saw a kind of Durkheimian functionalism in that. So if you just comment.
Marx's conception of the organic whole, not Durkheim's.
Yeah.
Definitely not Durkheim. So this is the piece you were mentioning by Foster is the universal metabolism piece. So that's the piece where he says he's not a dualist.
Yes.
Yeah. So first of all, John is a dualist, and he says as much in that paper because if you one of the great things about a dialectical method is this: the categories that you start with are not the categories you end with. John is a friend of mine, so let me be clear about that. I like John. I think John is a wonderful guy. I think he's a brilliant intellectual, but he's dead wrong about this. The categories that he's begun with are the categories that he's ended with. And John Bellamy Foster, who I admire and respect, that piece is written in response to the world ecology critique. And what you'll notice is that he doesn't actually want to deal with my argument. I'm the first person he cites, and then he wants to go and talk about how all these other people got it wrong. So Foster, I think Foster's problem is that he continues to see things as the economy in one box and the ecology in the other box. He does make the philosophical point that they're related. Okay, we know that. We know humans are a part of nature. We all live on planet Earth. But the big question is, how does that sensibility that humans are a part of nature, humanity and nature, nature and humanity, how does that compel a rethinking of a lot of our basic categories? Because what modernity does is it turns relations into things. And it turns relations that are dialectical into dualism. So one of the things that people often ask me is, well, of course humans are distinct. And I say, yes, of course humans are distinct. Yes, that is true. It is one thing to identify distinctions. It is another thing to say that what humans do can be called social relations that is independent and prior to their interactions with the rest of nature. And that's what Foster does. And unfortunately, Foster has chosen to align himself with other scholars like Richard Clark and Richard York and Brett Clark, who are positivists and have a very mechanical view of how this works. And they believe, although Foster does not seem to believe this, that humans are separate from nature. So yeah, I think Foster is trying to avoid the debate, and that's unfortunate. And he doesn't understand dialectics. They think that dialectics is interaction. Interaction is not dialectics. Dialectics involve asymmetry, empire and colony, capital and labor, town and country. They involve asymmetries whose terms shift over time. And so that might sound very abstract, but in fact I would say that it's deeply political and deeply relevant and deeply practical. And I think that it's something that the food sovereignty movements, for all their problems, have grasped. That there is a dialectical relation and not a dualist one. Because the old left said, well, we want food and we want equality and we want land. But they were all separate.
Yeah.
They could be parceled out. But what at first feminists and then anti-colonial activists in the late 19th and early 20th century were saying, no, we're not going to wait for economic socialism until we have to get gender equality or racial equality or national equality. That has to be part of the fundamental project. And now we need to say that has to be part of our fundamental thinking about how capitalism is within nature. We may not like what it does, or we might think some of what it does is okay. But until we get out of that dualist position, our politics are going to be very much in the position of, say, pre-World War I socialism, where we thought that what we needed to control was the economy, and we needed to use the state to control it. And it was very fragmented, and it said a lot of things had to wait. And food sovereignty says, no, these things can't wait. In fact, they all fit together, and they all work together, or they don't work at all. That cultural determination and sustainability and democratization all work together, or they don't work at all.
Thank you. Yes, a question? Yeah. Would you like to? You have a question.
Well, yes, I could ask one question. Hello, my name is David Harnesk. I'm actually part of the same research school as Andreas Malm was, so I'm very happy to hear that you.
Oh, wonderful! Andreas is brilliant.
He is, so I'm not as brilliant. So disclaimer right there from the get-go. So I have a question about methodology, or maybe advice to early career researchers, as many of us in this room is. And it basically has to do with this idea, kind of a contrast between what is commonly referred to as the critical part of research and the problem-solving part of research. A false dualism, mayhaps. But a lot of people here in this room want to, contribute to a transition towards sustainability. In fact, it's a big part of the discussion that we've been having thus far. What do you think that your ideas on the world ecology how can that help us working with issues of today, and more specifically, being not an historian, how can I or we rely on your thoughts and moving forward?
Well, that's a fantastic question. And there are several parts to that.
Yes.
I think, first of all, the way that I approach these questions and these issues is as if we are in a conversation, which is what we are. So, to the extent that some of these arguments are useful, take them and make them your own and rework them. So, they're not, I'm not Moses coming down from the mountain with the commandments, right?
Yeah.
These are propositions. And in fact, I think this is why world ecology has worked as well as it has, and who knows where it's going from here, is that what we say is we really only have one directive, which is how do we take the basic philosophical premise that humans are part of nature and rethink our methods, our narratives, and our analyses, and yes, our policy prescriptions in that light. So I think the first thing we need to get rid of is the idea that some policy prescriptions, in terms of your concrete question, are social and others are environmental. So we need to understand that they are always inextricably linked. And in fact, we have whole areas of public policy that already do this. Public health, for one, right?
Yeah.
So we're already doing this. But the old ways of thinking die hard. I would say, of course, that you can never admit a dualism to any of this because one dualism leads to others. Practically, I think that practically in terms of being an intellectual, this is the zeitgeist. This is the spirit of our times. I think that especially for younger scholars in my experience, my age or often younger, under 40 by and large, are looking for new ways to think and grapple with the world around them. And there is a dissatisfaction amongst many of this kind of confinement that we get when we have to talk about social relations and environmental consequences. Somebody out of your program at Lund, Giovanni Bettini, brilliant. We have this discussion early on where he said, well, I'm doing environmental migration. I said, isn't all migration environmental? Which it is.
Yes.
It is, and always has been. Which I think actually had some impact on him because he's still doing very, very interesting work. So I think that you can break, I think that there is space intellectually to make new ground. Now, I think politically what needs to happen is that we need to look at especially the role of the state in asserting itself against the logic of capital. And I know that's kind of an old-fashioned way to say it, but we need to look at ways to decommodify and to take capital out of the environmental question as much as possible. So somebody like Christian Parenti, who is doing some great work on the environment-making state in a world ecology perspective, has been writing some wonderful short essays on the role of the state in climate change that I think need to be taken very seriously. That's the work of Christian Parenti, who writes for The Nation magazine, amongst other places. So, yeah, I mean, I think we need to look at things like climate change. Obviously, in an era of climate change, the only institution big enough to deal with it is the state. But what kind of state is it going to be? It could be a very authoritarian state that is deeply oppressive and supports sharp inequality. That's one model that's very much in front of us. The other model could be a state that actually understands that the relations between people and the relations with the rest of nature are one, and that we need to pursue ways of dealing with climate change, including decarbonization. The technology for that is clearly here. There's no reason why we couldn't decarbonize the atmosphere through mass-producing carbon removal machines more than automobiles, say. I think that's where we need to look at, and we need to understand also that the state is a product of class forces, and that might sound old-fashioned, but that is absolutely true. That the state is shaped by the class relations around it. So I think that's where there are a lot of questions in what you said, so I'm trying to deal with them all. But I think also, look, the role of the intellectual is to be an intellectual and to speak the truth. The role of the intellectual isn't to go and be a politician. The role of politicians is to go and be a politician. The role of policymakers is to go and make policy. The role of the intellectual is to point out the constraints and the opportunities of politics and possibility, and to speak the truth to power. And that might sound old-fashioned, but I think that is an absolutely beautiful and crucial lesson of the past century. That is what intellectuals have helped us do at their best. From the critique of Nazism to the critique of global warming.
Okay.
Thank you, by the way.
So now I think I would like to ask a question.
Yes, okay. Please, do you? No? Okay, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm very interested in the chances for deliberative democracy to solve environmental problems, and you have pointed out that you are a believer of this, and I would like to hear your perspective on it.
Well, as we know from the past century, democratization occurs when social movements force capital to back down. So that's why we get social democracy in Europe. Why? Because the strength of the labor and then resistance movements led by communists and socialists forced a historic concession on capital. So we get social democracy, which is not particularly socialist or particularly democratic in my view, but more democratic than the alternatives. So, we have to understand that modernity is based on a very limited kind of democracy, and that if we want a more thoroughgoing and profound democratization of everyday life, then we need to think about a different kind of way of organizing human civilization.
but I don't see the mechanism that you draw or that you have in mind that would.
There is no mechanism. There are only ways to think about the present moment.
But why do you think that democracy is the answer?
Well, perhaps we're talking about different things, but because you can look at what are the relations between authoritarian politics and both human well-being and the well-being of the rest of nature. The historical record is absolutely clear on this. Authoritarian politics is absolutely ruthless towards human populations and towards extra-human natures.
Okay.
I mean, so democratization always opens up the possibility for more egalitarian and more emancipatory relations between humans and the rest of nature. That is when people in our everyday lives have the opportunity to discuss and debate and work out solutions. So, I mean, you see this in climate change. I mean, the first thing that the ruling elites of the global north want to do is to restrict the terms of the climate debate around what is possible. So this is here the role of ideology and all the rest. But I think ultimately what you're talking about are, what are the political contradictions of the world today that would allow for a more democratic and sustainable alternative? And I think in order to deal with that question, you have to think it through very, very seriously. I think it's a very difficult question to think through. And I think it's a question that's impossible to think through, A, if you don't understand the history of the modern world, and B, if you contain the history of the modern world within nature plus society. So we need to look at the history of social revolutions from the Dutch and the English and the French and the Russians and the Vietnamese and the Cubans and all the rest to understand the possibilities of conditions and also the constraints of those real situations. Because one of the great things that happens, is certainly since the era of revolutions begun by the French in 1789, is that social revolutions open up space for more egalitarian relations between men and women, between relations of humans and the rest of nature. And then they often give way to more developmentalist programs, like the French did, like the Russians did, like the Chinese did. But they often open up real space. Now, we're in a different historical conjuncture today, and I think that we need to look at that very, very seriously. So we don't all need to be historians, but we all need to know a bit of history, and we all need to know a bit of political economy. I think that would be the other point, that if you don't understand how capital works, you're not going to understand the opportunities for democratization. So not like I know the answer to how capital works, but I'm simply posing the question.
And we have a Russian and a Polish student, two students here, so they have experience of what you have spoken. Yes, more questions? Or I think people are getting tired. It has been a very, very intensive. So should we finish now?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Well, thank you for all of your wonderful questions. Thank you, Justin and Gloria, for inviting me. And I hope some of this has given you food for thought. Even if you completely disagree with me, that can be very useful too. So disagree, but think about it.